All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're looking at a huge federal court ruling that really asks a fundamental question: who is actually in charge of our elections? This whole thing is a showdown between the Department of Justice and the state of California, and the judge's decision basically drew a line in the sand between federal power and states' rights. And that tension, well, it's at the very core of the debate over our democracy. Sometimes to really understand a story, you have to start at the end. And these were the powerful final words from federal Judge David O. Carter's ruling. And it's not just legal language, it's a stark, serious warning. And it sets the stage for a decision that has massive implications for everyone's privacy and voting rights. So to really get the full weight of this, we're going to start with the judge's conclusion and kind of work our way backward. So this warning from the bench, it tells you everything you need to know about just how high the stakes really are. So what's the bottom line here? It's simple. The Department of Justice took California to court, and the judge completely threw the case out. It was a clear-cut win for the state, and honestly, a pretty major smackdown of the federal government's entire approach. Okay, let's break down the nuts and bolts of this decision. And the DOJ wanted to get its hands on huge amounts of private voter data, but Judge Carter didn't just say no. He went further, saying the attempt imperils all Americans. He argued that if a change this big is going to happen, it has to come from Congress, not just the executive branch. And then he dismissed the case with prejudice. So now that's legal speak for this is over and don't even think about trying it again. He slammed the door shut for good. So that brings us to the big question, right? What was this fight really all about? Let's dig into what the DOJ was actually trying to do and why California decided to push back so hard. All right, so you've got two very different arguments here. On one side, you have the Department of Justice saying, hey, we need this voter data to make sure non-citizens aren't voting. But on the other side, you've got California saying, whoa, not so fast. The Constitution gives us the power to run our elections, and you're way out of line. And here's where it gets really interesting, kind of ironic, actually. The part of the DOJ that filed this lawsuit was the Civil Rights Division. This is the very same group that was created back in the 50s, so to protect civil rights and voting rights. Judge Carter definitely pointed this out, noting the irony that this division was now trying to collect massive amounts of voter data. So how can a judge make such a strong, decisive ruling? Well, it all goes back to the U.S. Constitution. Let's dive into the core legal principles he was using. And the heart of the judge's argument really comes down to one thing. Article 1 of the Constitution is pretty clear. It gives states the power to decide the time, place, and manner of their own elections. And what Judge Carter argued is that this wasn't an accident. The founders did this on purpose to keep the federal government from having way too much control over the vote. Judge Carter kept using this term executive fiat. What does that mean? Well, it's basically an order that comes straight from the executive branch without ever going through Congress. He argued that something as fundamental as our privacy and voting rights can't just be changed by a decree. That kind of decision, he said, belongs to the people's elected representatives in Congress. And this quote right here just nails that point home for Judge Carter. This wasn't just a technical legal issue, it was about the process, saying, listen, if we as a country are going to have a debate about something this important, it has to happen out in the open, in Congress, through what he called the crucible of public debate. So who is this judge? To really get the full context here, it helps to know a little more about Judge Carter, because believe me, this isn't the first time he's been at the center of a major case involving executive power. Yeah, Judge Carter has a bit of a track record when it comes to significant cases tied to the Trump administration. Looking at his past decisions really gives you some insight into his thinking, especially on where he believes the limits of presidential power should be. So let's just look at this quick timeline. Back in 2022, he was the judge who made that explosive ruling that it was more likely than not that former President Trump had committed crimes related to overturning the 2020 election. That decision is what forced Attorney John Eastman to hand over those crucial emails to the January 6th committee. So now, and with this new ruling, you start to see a consistent theme, right? He keeps a very close eye on the boundaries of executive power. And in that earlier case with Eastman, he used a really powerful legal tool called the crime fraud exception. So normally, anything you tell your lawyer is completely private, right? So that's attorney-client privilege. But this exception basically says, nope, that privilege disappears if a judge thinks you were using your lawyer's advice to help you commit a crime. It was a landmark move for him to invoke. Okay, so let's zoom out from the legal weeds for a minute and look at the bigger picture here. The judge's ruling wasn't just a dry legal document. It was more like a civics lesson, and he was pulling from some big moments in American history to make his point. He reached all the way back to the very founding of America, quoting Benjamin Franklin's famous warning. His point was pretty clear. Democracy is not a guarantee, it's fragile, it's something you have to actively protect. And he saw this case as a real test of whether we could, in fact, protect our country, keep it. And then he brought in Abraham Lincoln with that incredible quote, "The ballot is stronger than the bullet." And he was making the case that the most essential power we have in a democracy is our vote. And by protecting the privacy of voters, he argued he wasn't just ruling on a legal technicality, he was defending the very foundation of the country. And finally, he capped it all off with a quote from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The message is simple but powerful. We can't trade away our core principles like privacy and fair elections for convenience. The moment we start doing that, he warns, we're on a path to losing everything. So this whole case leaves us with a huge question, one that sits at the center of so many debates in America today. Look, everybody wants secure and fair elections. That's not the debate. The real question is, what is the role for the federal government, and where exactly is the line between helpful oversight and dangerous overreach? So that's the question this ruling really forces all of us to think about.